She didn't stop. Not when the northern pass collapsed behind her in a wall of white and wind. Not when her horse went perfectly still at a pair of gates she had never seen before, and refused to take another step. Not in any of the long, strange days that followed, when the most closed-off man in the entire Northern Highlands looked at her the way a person looks at something they thought they had buried forever, standing right there in the snow like it had been waiting. Most people, when December takes everything they planned and replaces it with nothing, do the reasonable thing. They grieve the plan. They turn back. They wait for better weather. Elowyn Blackthorne was not most people. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a cartographer who had spent his whole life teaching her that every map has a margin, and that the margin is where the real country lives. She had been reading edges her whole life, the edge of a storm before it broke, the edge of a smile before the warmth reached the eyes, the edge of a room right before something changed inside it. She had planned her escape from Drex and Nightfang's mating arrangement with the kind of quiet, careful precision that leaves nothing to chance. 6 weeks of planning, the northern pass, the timing, the provisions, the horse. Documents her father hadn't asked about, and she hadn't explained. She had been thorough. She had been exact. The storm had been more exact. What if the storm that destroyed your carefully drawn map was the only thing that could have ever led you somewhere no map could find? By the time Elowyn understood, she had lost the northern pass entirely, or the trail behind her had already closed. The map in her saddlebag had become a piece of paper with opinions, and the map inside her head, the one her father had spent 20 years teaching her to trust, had gone very, very quiet. She pulled her horse to a stop in front of gates that rose from the dark like they had always been there, waiting for exactly this moment. Obsidian black, carved with wolves caught mid-howl, their stone eyes wide open against the storm, as if they had seen every desperate traveller who had ever come this far, and were still, somehow, unmoved. Her horse didn't tremble. It simply went still, the particular stillness of an animal that has made a decision and is no longer open to argument. The sign on the iron crossbar read, Stormclaw Territory, House of the Alpha King. She had not planned this, or she had not mapped this, but she had dreamed of these exact gates 4 nights in a row. The same dream, every time, the stone wolves, a single lamp burning in a high window, a figure standing perfectly still against a sky full of snow, watching. She had told herself it was anxiety, the mind rehearsing danger before it arrived. Standing here now, with the storm howling at her back, and the gate exactly as she had seen it, down to the particular angle of the lamp above, the number of wolves carved into the right pillar, the iron crossbar sitting just slightly crooked at the centre. She ran out of ways to explain it away. She pushed the gates open, high inside the keep, in a room full of territorial maps and correspondence he had been reading without seeing for the better part of an hour. Zoran Stormclaw sat alone at a long table. Or he appeared to be 36. The weight behind his eyes was considerably older. Dark hair, broad across the shoulders, eyes the colour of deep river water in shadow, grey-green, steady, and very far away. He had held the Northern Highland territories as Alpha King for 11 years. He had been alone for 9 of them, since the night Zelyra Stormclaw was taken from him. Not by an enemy he could name or fight, by the slow, patient cruelty of a man who had decided her bloodline was worth more than her life. When her scent reached him through 3 floors of stone and howling wind, he went completely still. Not instinct, something older, something that bypassed thought entirely and settled deep in the chest, like a door swinging open in a house that had been shut for years. He crossed to the window, looked down, or she was standing in the courtyard with snow on her shoulders and a candle in her hand. Someone must have pressed it into her palm at the outer gate, looking up at his keep the way a person looks when they have already made a decision and are simply waiting for the conversation to begin. He pressed his palm flat against the cold glass. "She should not have come here," he said to the empty room. It sounded like a warning. It settled in the air like the first honest thing he had said in 9 years. Elowyn Blackthorne stepped inside. The northern pass had closed in 3 hours. Elowyn had budgeted 6. She had studied the Highland weather reports. She had spoken, carefully and indirectly, to 2 different shepherds from the Eastern Valley who made the crossing in winter every year. For she had chosen the 3rd week of December, because every record she could find said the 3rd week of December had the most stable window. Every record had been wrong. The storm came from the northwest, which no one had predicted, which meant it hit the pass from the side rather than head-on, which meant it didn't build slowly with warning. It arrived, all at once, without manners, without apology, without any interest in the 6 weeks she had spent arranging her escape from a man who had been arranging her life without her permission. Drexen Nightfang, Beta Lord of the Southern Reach. A man who had announced 3 months ago, through pack elders who had not consulted her, that Elowyn Blackthorne was to be his mate. He had said it the way a person announces the purchase of a piece of land. Settled, final, had already processed through the right channels. She had smiled. She had said nothing. She had gone back to her father's study that evening and begun very carefully pulling at threads. What she found underneath the threads was worse than she expected. Drexen Nightfang wasn't a man in love. He wasn't even a man driven by simple ambition. He was a man in debt to a council faction that had been quietly moving pieces across the Highland board for over a decade. And what they wanted was something that ran in Elowyn's blood. Something the oldest Highland records called storm-born sight. The ability to read weather patterns, hidden land formations, the invisible shape of territorial fault lines, with uncanny and unsettling precision. She had lived with it her whole life. She had thought it was simply her father's training-made instinct, or she had no idea it was something men would build 10-year plans around. She had no idea people had died because of it. She found that out in the 6th week, by candlelight, in her father's study, reading a document she was never supposed to find. It was tucked inside a cartographic folio from 15 years ago, slid between 2 survey maps of the Western Lowlands, in the handwriting of a council archivist who had since died of circumstances that, read alongside what she now knew, looked considerably less circumstantial than they had at the time. The document was a summary, clinical, brief, the way truly dangerous information is often presented, dressed in the language of administration, as if giving a terrible thing a professional tone makes it less terrible. It described the storm-born bloodline, its history, its strategic applications, or the faction that had been monitoring it for 11 years, the name of the man they had tasked with securing it, Drexen Nightfang. She sat with the document in her hands for a long time. The candle burned lower. The house around her was quiet. Then she folded the document into the inside pocket of her travelling coat, blew out the candle, and went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about Drexen's smile, the one that arrived before the warmth, the one she had been reading as the sign of a man who was merely cold by nature, strategic by habit, incapable of real warmth but not malicious. She revised that reading. She had been looking at the symptom. The document had shown her the disease. She found that out in the 6th week, the night before she was supposed to leave. She left a day early. Now the pass was closed. What the snow was a solid wall at her back. Her horse, a grey mare named Dusk, who had never in 4 years of service expressed an opinion about anything, had come to a complete halt at the sight of a pair of obsidian gates and was communicating, through stillness alone, that this was as far as she went. Elowyn looked at the gates. The gates looked back. She had seen them before. She knew this the way you know a face you haven't seen in years, the specific recognition that lives somewhere below the mind, in the part of you that keeps records the rest of you doesn't have access to. 4 nights of the same dream. Stone wolves mid-howl. A high window with 1 lamp. A figure in the dark, watching. She had told herself it was anxiety. She dismounted. She walked forward. She pushed the gates open. They swung with less resistance than she expected, as though they had been waiting, and she walked through. The courtyard was stone. The snow had found every crack and settled in. Torches burned in iron brackets along the inner wall, and by the time she had walked 10 steps, a door at the far end of the keep had opened. A young woman came out with a candle and a look of careful, professional neutrality. She took Dusk's reins. She pressed the candle into Elowyn's free hand. "The Alpha King will see you," she said. Elowyn looked up at the keep. High in a window on the 3rd floor, a lamp burned. And for just a moment, 1 breath, 2, she saw the shadow of a figure standing there. Then it was gone. She walked inside. The entrance hall was stone and warmth, a fire burning at the far end. Tapestries along the walls showing highland ranges and storm formations in deep blues and greys. She was still reading one of them, a remarkably accurate rendering of a winter weather pattern she recognized from her father's books, when she heard the stairs. He came down them without hurry, without noise, almost, for a man of his size. Zoran Stormclaw. She had heard the name. Everyone in the northern highlands had heard the name. The Alpha King of the Stormclaw territories. Ruler of the highest and most unforgiving stretch of land in the north. A man who had held his borders through 3 territorial disputes without losing a single acre, without making a single unnecessary alliance, without, according to every account she had encountered, so much as raising his voice. In person, he was quieter than she expected, and much harder to look away from. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. His composure was total, the kind that has been practiced so long it no longer looks like practice. His eyes found her face and held there for 1 beat longer than simple assessment required. "You came through the storm," he said. Not a question. "The storm came through the pass first," she said. There wasn't much road left. "The northern approach, the Blackthorn crossing." She went still, just slightly. "You know it. I know every approach to this territory." He looked at her with that steady, river-deep gaze. "I don't know you." "Elowyn Blackthorn." She kept her voice even. "My father is Varric Blackthorn, cartographer. We hold no territory. We have no political alliances that would concern you." A beat. "I was trying to leave the southern reach, but the storm had other ideas." Something moved behind his eyes, small, fast, gone before she could name it. "You'll stay until the roads are passable," he said. It was not precisely an offer. It was not precisely a command. It was simply the conclusion his logic had arrived at, stated plainly. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was Varric Blackthorn's daughter, and old habits die hard. "Your tapestry is wrong." He paused. "The 3rd from the left. The storm formation pattern over the Veth Ridge. The rotation curves east before it descends, not west. Whoever drew it was working from a summer observation. The winter behavior is different." A silence settled between them. Then, "I'll have someone show you to a room." He turned and walked back up the stairs. At the third step, without turning around, "What," he said, "the tapestry has been wrong for 6 years. No one has mentioned it." She looked at the tapestry, then back at the stairs, where he had already gone. She filed that away, the way her father had taught her to file things that didn't make sense yet. Not forgotten, not forced, just held. In the guest room, with the fire burning and dusk settled in the stables below, Elowyn sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded and looked at the wall for a long time. She had dreamed these gates. She had seen this keep. She was sitting in a room she had never been in before, and the specific smell of it, wood smoke and dried highland herbs and something faintly mineral, like stone after rain, was familiar in a way she could not explain. She was a practical woman. She believed in what she could measure. She had no explanation for any of this. She filed that away too. The first morning in Stormclaw territory, Elowyn woke before dawn and asked to be useful. She was aware of how it sounded. She was aware that most guests, when received by an Alpha King through an act of storm-driven charity, presented themselves at breakfast and made polite, careful conversation until the roads cleared. She was not wired for polite, careful conversation. She never had been. The pack elder who met her in the lower hall was a woman named Arvella Ironwood, 60-something. White-haired, sharp-eyed, she had the bearing of someone who had been the most competent person in every room she'd ever entered, and was entirely comfortable with that fact. She studied Elowyn the way a healer studies a new patient, taking inventory, not making judgments yet. "Well, you asked to help," Arvella said. "What can you do?" "I was raised in a cartographer's household," Elowyn said, "which means I know field medicine, preservation, weather reading, record management, and herb work." She paused. "Also, I can set a bone, but I prefer not to." Arvella considered this for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the eastern storeroom. "Come." Arvella had been managing a winter cough for 2 seasons, a deep, rattling thing that arrived in November and stayed through March. 3 different remedies had managed the edges of it without addressing the root. Elowyn identified the root in the time it took Arvella to climb 1 flight of stairs, the particular sound of the cough when the older woman's breath shortened mid-step, the way she pressed 2 fingers to her sternum without thinking, and the color of her lips in the cold corridor. "Moisture in the lower lung," Elowyn said, matter-of-factly. "Not infection. The cold air is irritating tissue that's already compromised. You need Highland compress on the chest at night, dried hollow root steam twice a day, and something warm and honey-thick to coat the throat before you go out in the mornings." Arvella stopped walking, turned, looked at her. "My father treated it in shepherds who spent winters at altitude," Elowyn said. "It's common. Most people mistake it for something worse." By afternoon, Arvella breathed more easily than she had in 2 seasons. By evening, Elowyn had noticed 3 other things in the keep that needed quiet attention. A window seal in the west corridor, letting cold air under the frame. A drainage issue in the lower storeroom that would rot the root vegetable supply by February, and a young pack member in the training yard who was compensating for a left shoulder injury by overusing his right side in a way that would create a second injury within the month. She mentioned each one, briefly, without fanfare, and then went back to whatever she was doing. Kyle Ironwood, Zoran's beta and Arvella's nephew, was a man who noticed everything and reacted to very little. He watched all of this from a careful, professional distance. That evening, he reported to Zoran with the factual neutrality he used for all pack business, and then added one sentence he had not planned. "She moves through this territory," Kyle said, like she has already decided it belongs to her. Not the way someone claims a place, or the way someone comes home. Zoran said nothing. He stood at the window for a long time after Kyle left the room. The archive evenings began on the second night. Elowyn had asked about Stormclaw territorial history, genuinely, carefully, with the interest of someone who actually wanted to know rather than someone making conversation. Zoran, without quite deciding to, pulled 3 volumes from the shelf and set them on the table between them. He answered briefly at first. One-sentence responses, accurate and controlled. Then gradually, the sentences grew. He talked about the original Stormclaw borders, the winter of the Third territorial dispute, or the way the Eastern Ridge behaved differently than any map predicted because of an underground water system that no one had documented until his grandmother had the patience to trace it for a decade. He talked about his grandmother for 11 minutes without appearing to notice he was doing it. Elowyn listened without interrupting. Her hands were folded on the table. She asked one question at a time, and every question showed she had been paying attention to the answer that came before. In 9 years of sitting in this room, Zoran had not had a conversation like this one. He covered the realization immediately, but it took him a fraction of a second longer than it should have. Elowyn filed that away. Cale appeared on the second evening. He came to the top of the main staircase in bare feet and dark trousers and a sleep shirt, with his dark hair pressed flat on one side from the pillow. 7 years old. His father's build already visible in miniature, wide across the shoulders, straight, deliberate in the way he held himself. But his eyes were different. Zoran's eyes held distance. Cale's eyes held something quieter. The particular quiet of a child who has learned that needing things too much is a way of getting hurt. He looked at Elowyn from the top step for a long moment. She looked up and met his gaze. She did not adjust her voice. She did not perform warmth. She did not smile in the careful, performing way adults often smile at children when they want to seem unthreatening. She simply met his eyes, equal to equal. "You're the Storm Woman," Cale said. Not a question, a conclusion he had already reached and was now confirming. "Was your gates let me in?" she said. "I haven't decided yet if that was the Storm's idea or mine." Something shifted in his face. Very small, significant in a way that required knowing him to read. He came down the stairs and sat in the chair across from her, without being asked, without ceremony, with the complete naturalness of someone who has decided a thing and sees no reason to announce it. They sat in companionable quiet for 20 minutes. Elowyn read. Cale looked at the archive shelves with the thoughtful focus of someone taking inventory. From the hallway, at a distance he was maintaining with professional discipline, Zoran watched his son choose this woman's company out of his own free will. His son, who trusted no one quickly, who had been learning caution since he was 4 years old, and understood, at 7, but what loss actually meant. Something moved in Zoran's chest. He covered it. He turned and walked back to his room. He stood at the window and watched the snow come down and breathed very carefully. The warmth in the archive below him reached him anyway. The next morning, Elowyn appeared at the map table where Zoran was working and said simply, "The hollow route in your eastern store is almost gone. You'll need to send to the Valley Market before the next cold front, or Arvella will lose the treatment mid-season." He looked up from the map. She was already heading toward the kitchen. He sat with that for a moment. Then he sent Kyle to the Valley Market. At the archive table that night, Their hands reached for the same volume at the same time, not quite touching, one breath apart. Neither moved away. The fire was the only sound in the room. 1 beat. 2. 3. He looked up. She looked up. 2 people on either side of a long table, and something between them that neither had named and both had noticed, and were now regarding from a careful, safe, entirely unconvincing distance. He pulled back first, set the book between them, said something composed about the hour. She watched him stand, watched him cross to the window with those shoulders holding their careful, practiced line. The line of a man who has spent 9 years keeping himself arranged in a way that would not cost him anything, that would not give the world a grip on anything it could pull away. She thought, with the same calm precision she used on every problem she encountered. He is afraid of wanting something again. He is afraid that if he lets himself want it, the world will take it the way it took Zelaira. He is afraid that this is simply how his life goes, that the things he loves become the things that are taken, and that loving anything is therefore a form of putting it in danger. She understood that completely. She had spent 6 weeks dismantling a plan that had been built entirely around what she was worth to someone else. She knew, in her bones, what it felt like to have your value decided by other people, to be a variable in someone else's equation. She looked back at the text. She turned a page. She let him have the quiet. What she did not do was move away from the table. What she did not do was make the moment smaller by addressing it before it was ready. She simply stayed and read, and let the warmth of the archive hold them both inside it, together and separately, not the fire burning between them like something patient that has decided to wait as long as it takes. And across the keep, through 2 walls and a corridor, in a chair beside the guest room, fire, because his room was, he claimed, cold. Cale Stormclaw slept with one hand resting on his own knee and the other stretched toward the warmth of the hearth, the determined peace of a child who has decided where he is most comfortable and sees no reason to be anywhere else. Day 5 in Stormclaw territory. Elowyn found the folio on a Thursday. She had been following a reference, a footnote in one of the territorial history volumes, mentioning an older cartographic survey of the Veth Ridge, the same ridge whose storm pattern she had corrected in the tapestry. The footnote pointed to the lower archive, a room smaller and older than the main one, and with stone walls that held the cold in a particular way, and a smell of dust layered over something faintly floral, highland flowers, pressed between pages, so long ago that the paper had absorbed their scent and kept it. She had the lantern in one hand and her notes in the other. She found the shelves of cartographic folios in the far corner. 2 survey maps of the Veth Ridge. Detailed. Correct. The kind of work her father would have respected. Between them, a 3rd folio, thinner than the others. No label on the spine. She pulled it out. Inside, in a woman's careful, deliberate handwriting, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who understands that what they are writing down matters, that the record itself may become the thing that matters most, were maps. Not survey maps, not topographical studies, movement patterns, and network maps, names connected by thin inked lines to other names, to locations, to dates, the work of someone tracking a system of relationships they were not meant to be tracking. The name at the center of every map was Drexen Nightfang. Elowyn set the lantern down very carefully on the floor. She crouched in the cold and turned pages. Zelaira Stormclaw had been mapping Drexen Nightfang's network for 2 years before her death. The entries were methodical, patient. The handwriting never hurried, never shook, even as the picture she was assembling became darker, page by page. names of pack elders who had received payments they didn't report, routes used to move information between the Southern Reach and the Highland Council faction, but a list of every woman in the Northern Territories who carried what the oldest records called storm-born sight, going back 3 generations, tracked, one by one, until Zelaira reached the last name on the list, Elowin's name. The last entry was pressed hard enough into the page to almost tear it. He is not after territory, he is after the line, and she will carry it next. Someone will need to protect her before she knows she needs protecting. Elowin sat with the folio on her knees for a long time in the cold of the lower archive. She was not a person who panicked. She had inherited her father's particular stillness in the face of difficult information, the cartographer's discipline of looking at a terrain. Honestly, even when the terrain is bad, because a wrong map kills people, and a correct one, however frightening, keeps them alive. She looked at this terrain honestly. Zelaira Stormclaw had not died of chance. She had not been taken by random cruelty or the indifferent violence that sometimes touched lives at the edge of political power. She had died because she was getting close, because she was the person most likely to find the shape of Drexen Nightfang's plan and name it out loud before it could be executed. He had removed her. With the same cold patience he applied to everything else, and then he had turned his attention back to the bloodline she had been trying to protect. For 9 years, Zoran Stormclaw had been living with the grief of losing Zelaira to an enemy he couldn't name or fight. He had her maps in his archive and didn't know what they meant. He had been carrying the weight of a loss without a face and a rage without a direction. Elowin closed the folio. She replaced it exactly as she had found it. She stood up. She walked to the upper sitting room and sat in front of the fire and put her hands in her lap and looked at the flames. There was a sound at the door. Zoran. He had seen the light under the archive door and came to check it. He stood in the corridor now, not entering, one hand on the frame. "You found something," he said. Not a question. She looked up at him. His face was composed, but he had known, before he came downstairs, what room she was in. And there was something in the line of him, something carefully held, that told her he already knew what was there to find. She was tracking him, Elowin said, for 2 years. She had the whole shape of it. Zoran was quiet for a long time. Then he came into the room and sat in the chair across from her. She asked him about Zelaira. Not about her death. About her. Who she had been when she was alive. What she had loved. What she had known. He was still for a moment. Then, slowly, he talked. Not the grief version. The real version. A woman who read territorial maps the way other people read faces, not as documents, but as living things, as arguments the land was making about itself. A woman who had been in the middle of something important when she died, something she hadn't told him the full shape of, because she hadn't wanted to frighten him before she was certain. She was trying to find something, Elowin said. I know. His voice was quiet. I never finished looking for what it was. She held his gaze for a beat. I think I found it. He looked at her across the fire. Of the thing he kept sealed behind his composure, the thing that was patient and quiet and enormous moved forward. Not all the way. Not yet. But it was visible, just for a moment, in the way his eyes changed. The river going from dark to lit in the space of a second, the way water catches light when the clouds shift. He did not cover it immediately. He let it be seen. Later, after he had stood, quietly, and said something composed about needing to review the morning reports, and she had watched him walk to the window and stand there with his shoulders at that careful line, Kyle appeared, barefoot, blanket over one arm, face entirely serious. "My room is cold," he announced. She opened the door wider. He marched in, or set himself up in the chair by the fire with the dignity of someone who had made a considered decision and was not interested in discussing it. Pulled the blanket around himself. Closed his eyes. Elowyn sat back on the edge of the bed and looked at him for a moment. This small, careful, grave child who had decided to trust her with the specific completeness of someone who does not trust easily, and means it entirely when they do. Across the keep, on the other side of two walls and a landing, Zoran saw the warm light under the guest room door. He stood in the dark corridor outside his own room and did not go back to his maps. He stood there long enough to understand that Kyle had been right. It was already too late to be careful. Day 8. Morning. Kyle's scout report arrived at breakfast with the kind of careful, deliberate neutrality that said clearly, "What I am about to tell you is going to change something in this room." "The northern pass has reopened," he said. Elowyn set down her cup. She left that morning. 3 days. 4 at most. She had a paper trail started before she ever arrived at the Stormclaw gates. Her father's correspondence case, documents in 2 villages south of the mountains that she needed to complete the picture. She could not act on what she knew with half a map. Zoran was at the window when she told him. He turned. His face was composed. Everything behind it was not. "How long?" he said. 4 days. I'll send word." 1 nod. Nothing else. Kyle was in the stables, ostensibly brushing his horse, actually conducting a one-sided argument with the horse about the general unfairness of waiting. Or he stopped when he saw her travel bag. His face held the perfect stillness of someone who is 7 years old and has already learned that showing a feeling out loud sometimes costs more than keeping it in. "You're leaving?" he said. "For a few days." He looked at her very directly. "Promise you'll come back." She crouched down to his eye level. "I always return to the places that feel worth returning to," she said. "I haven't found many. This is one." He gave a single, very serious nod, then turned back to the horse, who had opinions about none of this. Zoran was in the courtyard when she rode through. He stood aside. Then, as she passed, "Take the southern road through the valley. The northern approach is faster. The southern is safer. This time of year, safer matters more." His voice was level. His eyes were not. "I'll take the south," she said. "Thank you, Zoran." She did not look back. If she had, she would have seen him standing in the empty courtyard, long after the road curved and she disappeared from sight. Kyle appeared at his shoulder some time later. Neither of them spoke. After a long time, Zoran said quietly, to the empty air in front of him, "She carries the same qualities Elira had, the kind that makes the floor feel solid when she's standing on it beside you, which is exactly why I intend to be careful." Kyle was quiet for a moment. "Of course," he said, neutrally. Zoran looked at him. Kyle held his expression with the professional calm of a man who had been holding expressions for 20 years, in service of a man who needed, occasionally, to be allowed to work things out at his own pace. They had known each other for 20 years, or some things could not be hidden at 20 years. Zoran looked back at the road, at the place where it curved and she had disappeared, at the empty stretch of snow and stone that still held the faint impression of dusk's hooves moving southward, already filling in with new snow. "It's already too late, isn't it?" he said. Not quite a question. "Yes," Kyle said, kindly. And then, because he was Kyle Ironwood, and some things needed to be said even when they were obvious, It has been too late since approximately the second evening, when you spent 40 minutes explaining the underground water system to someone who was supposed to be a temporary guest. A pause. I counted the minutes. Zoran said nothing. "She'll come back," Kyle added, simply. "I know," Zoran said. He did know. He knew it the same way he knew the Vethridge weather behaved differently in winter than in summer, not because logic demanded it, but because he had read the territory well enough to understand what it was telling him. She would come back. She had looked at this, keep the way a person looks at something they intend to return to. She had looked at Kale the way you look at something you would not leave behind. She would come back. He was simply going to have to sit with the 4 days between now and then. The 3 days Elowyn spent in the south were the most efficient and the most frightening of her life. Her father's study. Musty and beloved, the smell of it, the smell of her entire childhood. She moved through his research journals with the focused speed of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and is afraid of what they will find. What she found was worse than she thought. Drexen Nightfang had been mapping the Stormborn bloodline across 4 generations of her family. Every woman who carried it, every alliance she had made, every pack she had touched. He understood the gift better, in some ways, than Elowyn did herself, because he had spent a decade reading about it in the Council faction's private records, documents that were never meant to reach a cartographer's daughter in a southern village. Stormborn sight, freely given in a true mate bond, did not simply map weather. At its fullest expression, it mapped territory. Fault lines in an alpha's hold, vulnerabilities in a pack's structure. Given freely, but within a true bond, those vulnerabilities became visible and could be healed. The alpha could see exactly what his territory needed and address it before it became a wound. Drexen intended to take it. Not receive it. Take it. Through a forced bond, a arranged arrangement executed before the woman it affected had any real choice. And what he didn't know, what no one outside the oldest Highland records knew, was that taken by force, Stormborn sight did not map strength. It inverted. It read only collapse. It would not give him a weapon. It would give him a mirror pointed at his own foundation. His entire plan, executed exactly as designed, would destroy everything he was trying to build. Elowyn sat with this for a long time. Then she sealed every document into her father's correspondence case and sent a single line to Zoran Stormclaw. His reply arrived the next morning. 2 lines in his careful handwriting that looked exactly the way his voice sounded. Measured, quiet, meaning more than it said. Come back when you are ready. Bring everything. She read it twice. Something settled in her chest, warm and certain and newer than she had expected. Not a conclusion she had arrived at. A conclusion she had been walking toward for 8 days and had just reached the end of. She left at dawn. Kale was at the gate before the road straightened. He had been there for 20 minutes, balanced on the lowest rail, watching the bend in the road with the patient intensity of someone who was told to wait inside and chose not to. "I told Papa you'd come back," he said. Did he doubt it? Kale considered this very seriously. He paced. Kyle told him to stop. Twice. Elowyn thought about Zoran Stormclaw pacing. The image of it, the composed, controlled, carefully maintained Alpha King, moving back and forth across his own study because he was worried, settled somewhere in her chest alongside the warmth that had been there since that morning's letter. "Let's go inside," she said. "I brought something for you." Zoran was in the courtyard, not pacing now, still, watching her come through the gate with his composure arranged across his face like something he had recently repaired and was not fully confident in yet. She did not say anything dramatic. She dismounted. She handed Dusk's reins to the stable hand. She walked toward him and said simply, "I have everything. Let's build the complete picture." He looked at her for a moment. Something very real moved across his face. He did not hide it in time, and she thought he might not have tried. "Yes," he said. "Let's." At the archive table that night, with her documents spread between them alongside his territorial records, the full picture assembled itself, piece by patient piece. Drexen's network, the faction, the plan, the storm-born bloodline tracked across 3 generations, the forced bond he intended, the inversion he didn't know about, the collapse he was planning to cause that would, if executed, collapse him instead. Zoran set the last folder down. He looked at her across the table, at this woman who had walked into his territory through a storm, who had found Zelaira's hidden record, who had spent 3 days alone in the south, completing a map that most people would have run from, and said, "Whatever Drexen intends, you are not a resource. You are not a bloodline. You are not a plan someone else wrote." He looked at the table for a moment. "You are the person who walked into this territory in a storm and made it feel like something I had stopped believing it could be." He was quiet for a beat. "I simply wanted you to know that." Elowyn did not speak immediately. She let the words settle. She let them mean what they meant. "I know," she said, finally. "I have known for a while." Neither of them moved from the table for a long time after that. The fire burned low. The archive went dark at its edges. And in the chair by the wall, pulled up close enough to be part of the conversation without quite being in it, Cale had fallen asleep with his chin on his chest and a look of great satisfaction on his face. Zoran looked at his son, then at Elowyn. The expression on his face in that moment, unguarded, real, settled, was the expression of a man who has been cold for a very long time and has just come back into warmth and cannot quite believe the warmth is real and has decided to believe it anyway. The 10th day. A Thursday. No letter. No warning. Just the sound of a single horse on the stone approach. A deliberate, unhurried sound. The sound of someone who is not hiding their arrival because they don't feel they need to. And then Drexen Nightfang standing in the courtyard of Stormclaw territory with his dark coat perfectly pressed and that particular smile already arranged. The smile that arrived half a second before the warmth ever reached his eyes, because the warmth was an afterthought, added once the smile was in place, or the way a person adjusts a picture frame that keeps hanging slightly wrong. Elowyn stepped out first. She would not let him reach the door. She had spent 10 days coming to understand precisely what Drexen Nightfang was. Not a man in love. Not even a man of simple ambition, which at least carried something human in it. A man in service to a plan so thoroughly constructed that the people inside it had ceased to be people to him. They were positions on a map, variables in an equation. She had decided at some point in the last 10 days that she was done being a variable. "You chose the wrong shelter," Drexen said. His voice was smooth, pleasant, exactly as warm as it needed to be. "But I understand it. Stormclaw is impressive. Under other circumstances, I might even admire the choice." He tilted his head. "Come home, Elowyn. We can pretend none of this happened. I am a patient man." "I know you are," she said. "You've been patient for 10 years. That's how I know patience isn't the same as kindness." The smile stayed. "You are a map that belongs in my hands. That is not a threat. That is simply geography." "Maps?" she said, belong to whoever reads them honestly. You have never been honest about anything in your life. You tracked my bloodline across 4 generations. You dismantled a woman who had figured out what you were doing. You spent a decade building a plan to use a human being as a mechanism for a faction that doesn't care about the Northern Highlands or anyone who lives in them. She held his gaze, and you called it geography. For the first time, something in his expression shifted. Not the smile that stayed, but underneath it, like something flickered, recalculating. Then the door opened behind her. Zoran stepped out. He did not move past her. He stood at her shoulder, and the weight of his presence was the kind of weight that doesn't require announcement, the kind that arrives before any words do and takes up all the available space. "She is my guest," Zoran said, "my mate, and my territory does not receive men who speak to the people within it the way you have been speaking." His voice was entirely level. That was what made it frightening. Not heat, but the complete absence of any wasted energy. "You will want to choose your next move carefully, Nightfang." Drexen looked at Zoran. Zoran looked at Drexen. 9 years of reputation met 10 years of planning, and for just a moment, behind Drexen's practiced smile, something ran a rapid, quiet calculation. He reached for the blade at his side, silver-edged, short, not drawn for fighting, drawn as a statement, a negotiating tool. He swept it low and wide, not a slash, a redirect, trying to create space between Elowin and Zoran, to separate the leverage from the problem. And then Kale came through the door. He should not have been there. He was 7 years old, and he had been in his room when this began, and he had decided, with the absolute, inarguable logic of a child who loves without calculation, that he was not staying inside while the people he loved were outside. He came through the door at a full run and hit the top step and saw the blade in the same instant. Drexen swung it wide. There was a fraction of a second. One breath. Elowin did not think. She moved. She stepped across. Full body, no hesitation, yet the way her body decided before her mind had finished forming the decision. And the redirected blade caught her across the side, deep and long and entirely intentional in its result, even if the target had not been her. She went to one knee. The cold stone came up hard under her hand. Her other hand went to the wound, pressing. The pain arrived a half-second later, the way it always does. Delayed, as though the body needs a moment to process what has happened before it reports. Zoran was beside her before she finished falling, one hand behind her shoulder, one pressed over hers at the wound. And his face, the face she had been watching for 10 days, the one that lived behind composure the way warmth lives behind stone, was stripped clean, every layer gone, nothing left but what was underneath. He was trembling slightly. There's the kind of trembling that has nothing to do with cold. 9 years of iron-clad self-command, built brick by patient brick from grief and discipline, and the particular armor of a man who has decided he cannot afford to feel things all the way through. And it had cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way old stone cracks when the frost finally finds the center. Quietly, completely, without any possibility of being rebuilt exactly as it was. "Go inside," he said. The words barely held their shape. "Take Kale and go inside. Now." He did not look up from her face. "Before I lose the part of me that is keeping this from becoming considerably worse." She looked up at him, at the rawness in his face, at the fine trembling in the hands that were pressed against the wound with absolute steadiness, the steadiness of someone who is shaking on the inside and will not let it reach the surface where it might harm her. Her hand found his, She covered it. "Your darkness does not frighten me," she said quietly. "I told you that in the first week. I meant it every time." Something inside him, the last held thing, the final resistance, found its footing, like a bone being set. Exact. Necessary. Correct. Drexen retreated. He did not run. A man like Drexen Nightfang did not run. He withdrew, with the controlled stiffness of someone choosing to leave, constructing the appearance of choice where there was none. His smile was absent. It would come back later, in private, when he had time to reapply it. Inside, in front of the fire, Jarvella Ironwood cleaned and bandaged the wound with the professional quiet of someone who has seen battle injuries and knows how to be calm so that the injured person can afford not to be. Cale sat in the doorway with both hands wrapped around the frame. Not crying, not speaking. Watching his father kneel beside Elowin with that expression on his face. The expression Cale had been waiting 7 years to see. Without knowing that was what he'd been waiting for. His father, who had not cracked or broken or softened in all the years since his mother died. His father, who had stayed whole by staying sealed. His father, kneeling on the stone floor of the front room, with his hands pressed over a wound, and his face saying everything his voice had not. Cale decided 3 things in that moment. With the complete certainty of someone who is 7, and therefore unencumbered by doubt. He loved this woman. His father did too. He had simply not yet said it in the right language. 3 nights later. The torchlight appeared in the dark before the sound did. Orange lines cutting across the snow along every approach to Stormclaw territory, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that does not happen by accident and does not leave gaps by chance. 30 fighters, every exit sealed, every blind corner mapped, every approach covered. The work of someone who had been studying this territory from the outside for months, waiting for the exact right opening, and someone who had counted on patience as a strategy, and had arrived at a moment when the Alpha King's attention was split between a woman he loved and a danger he had already faced once. Drexen stood at the head of them, patient, recalibrated, the smile back in its correct position. The first window in the east corridor shattered before the last torch had taken its position. Zoran was outside before the sound finished echoing. He moved through Drexen's fighters the way the Stormclaw Mountains moved through weather. Not around, not over, but directly through, with a force that had nothing wasteful in it. Kyle took the east approach with 6 pack members and sealed it within the first 6 minutes. The territory's wolves met the assault at every point Drexen had mapped, was because the Alpha King knew his own territory better than any outsider's month of study could account for. The night was full of noise and cold, and the smell of torch smoke and iron. Elowin and Cale came out behind Zoran. She knew they shouldn't. Cale definitely knew he shouldn't, and had decided this information wasn't sufficient reason to stay inside. She put her hand on his shoulder, and they moved along the inner wall toward the east passage, where she could see the approach to the stables, where there was a position she could use to see the full spread of the attack and call directions to Cale's fighters. Then the arrow came from the tree line. She saw it before it arrived. Stormborn sight extended to trajectories, sometimes the path of a storm, the pull of a river current, as the arc of a well-aimed shot from a high position in the pine trees at the edge of the estate. It came in a long, deliberate line, and it was aimed at Cale, who had stepped forward in front of her to block a blow coming from the left. Time did what it always does in those moments. It went strange. Everything sharpened and slowed simultaneously, the way the world looks through water. Elowin saw the arrow's path. She saw exactly where Cale was standing. She saw exactly where the arrow was going. She moved, The arrow caught her in the chest, above the heart. Not the heart. Slightly above. She felt the impact the way you feel unexpected cold, total, immediate, and occupying every piece of attention she had. As the ground came up fast and she was on her knees in the snow, and then her palms were in the cold, and then she was on her side and the sky was tilted. Cale's voice, saying her name in a register she had never heard from him. The sound of it. Small, urgent. The specific terror of a child who has just understood that the people they love are not permanent, landed somewhere deep in her chest, alongside the pain. Worse than the pain in a way she didn't have words for. Then, Zoran's voice, cutting through everything else the way a bell cuts through weather. He reached her, one hand on her face, one pressed to the wound. Snow on the ground, and the siege still happening around them. Fighters moving, Kyle calling orders, the orange light of torches jumping, and Zoran's full attention was here, on this piece of ground, on her face. The second volley came, multiple arrows from 2 directions. Drexen had been holding them. This was the plan. To split the Alpha King's attention, to make him choose, to find the gap between the man and the Alpha, and put something in it. The arrows found Zoran. Several of them. He lurched but did not fall. He went to one knee in the snow beside her. Both of them bleeding. Both of them refusing to move. He looked at her. Everything behind his eyes. The 9-year distance, the ironclad composure, the careful management of every feeling that might cost him something, was simply gone. Not managed, gone. Dissolved like frost when the sun reaches it, leaving nothing behind but what had always been there underneath. She thought, in the strange, slow clarity that came with the cold and the pain and the particular heaviness of a moment that contains everything at once. I know this man. Not from 10 days. From something older than 10 days. From the first moment I looked up at that window and saw the shadow of a figure standing there, and felt, without any rational justification, that I had come somewhere I was meant to be. She had been a practical woman her whole life. She had believed in what she could measure. She had measured maps and weather and the quiet mathematics of how people meant the things they said. She had been very good at it. She measured this. His face, 6 inches from hers, with nothing held back and nothing performed. His hands, steady at the wound despite the arrows he had taken. The weight of him, present in the snow beside her, refusing to move. Or she had her answer. Cale needed a mother, he said. Barely a sound, the words moving through his breath more than his voice. And I needed to remember what it felt like to be known. You walked in out of a storm and did both, without asking, without performing anything. Just by being exactly who you are. He looked at her face with the kind of looking that wants to hold something in place. I would rather lose everything standing than let you go. Elowyn went very still, not from the wound, from the weight of being seen. She thought, with the calm precision that her mind reached for, even in its most extreme moments, about the storm-born sight. What it was. What the oldest record said it did, given freely, within a true bond, not mapped, not taken, given with full knowledge of what it cost by someone who had chosen. And the alternative was a world without him in it. She had been a practical woman her whole life. She believed in what she could measure. She measured this very clearly. A world with Zoran Stormclaw, alive and whole, and standing beside her, against whatever came next, versus a world where she kept her gift carefully sealed inside herself, while everything she had found in this keep bled out in the snow. There was no real measurement to do. There was only the choice. She pressed her hand over his wound, then over hers. She closed her eyes. The gift moved through her like warm water flowing downstream, natural and full, finding the place it was meant to go. The world softened at its edges. She was distantly, warmly aware of his wounds closing under her palm, of strength returning to the hand that held her, out of the sound he made, something she had never heard from him, somewhere between a name and a prayer, the sound of a man receiving something he had stopped believing existed. Then he pulled her close, and in the space between one breath and the next, without ceremony, without hesitation, with the total irrevocability of someone who has been on the edge of a decision for 10 days and has just stepped off, Zoran Stormclaw offered her the ancient bond, the one an Alpha King offers only once, the one that cannot be taken back, freely, without condition, without asking her to be smaller or different or more convenient, without asking her to be anything other than exactly, completely, stubbornly what she was. She did not fight it. She chose it. She chose him. For what Drexen Nightfang's 30 fighters encountered in the minutes that followed is not easy to describe cleanly. Only its result can be named. Drexen's operation, 10 years of architecture, 3 factional alliances, the careful construction of a plan he called the redrawing, was taken apart with the same thoroughness that it had been built, until only the man himself remained standing in the snow. He stood there with his practiced smile finally, completely, irrevocably absent, and he saw in Zoran's eyes what every person who has spent years building a strategy around a human being eventually sees when the human being chooses differently. The moment when the plan collapses, the moment when the thing he had decided was a resource turned out to have a will of its own. Drexen Nightfang fell, not to a blade, to the weight of what he had underestimated, the silence that settled over Stormclaw territory in the grey hour before dawn was the silence of something that had been building for a very long time, finally stopping. Like the moment after a storm breaks and the air goes still and you realize the world is still there, waiting. Zoran carried Elowyn to the inner keep. He laid her near the fire. He knelt beside her and tended the wound with hands that were, for the first time in all the days she had watched them, not quite steady, not shaking, not controlled, something human in between. Kyle stood in the doorway, both hands gripping the frame. He was 7 years old, and he had seen tonight what he had understood in theory, that love was real, and loss was real, and that they could arrive in the same night. He was not crying loudly. He was crying the way children cry, who have already learned to be quiet about the biggest things, silently. 2 streams. "Papa," he said. The word was smaller than he meant it to be. Zoran looked up from the wound, at his son. "Don't let her leave." Cale's voice was entirely steady, which made it worse. "She is our light." Zoran closed his eyes for a moment. He breathed. When he opened them, he looked at Cale, at this grave, careful, completely honest child who had taken one look at a storm-soaked stranger in a courtyard and decided she was worth keeping, and then he looked at the woman by the fire. "She is not leaving," he said. "Not now. Not ever." Cale nodded, once, with great dignity. Then he walked across the room and sat down on the floor beside his father, leaned against his arm, and stayed. The fire burned. The keep was quiet, but the obsidian gates of Stormclaw territory stood open in the dark, the stone wolves catching what little moonlight had made it through the clouds, their carved eyes watching the long approach of morning. She woke to stone ceiling and firelight. Cale was asleep in the chair beside her, his hand wrapped around her wrist. Even asleep, he was holding on, the grip of someone who had decided, with the full commitment of a 7-year-old who means everything he decides, that he was not letting go. Zoran was on the floor with his back against the wall. He had not moved to the chair. He was simply there, sitting between the door and the fire, watching over both of them with the stillness of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it in a way he has not been at peace with anything for 9 years. He looked at her when her eyes opened. Something in his face did something very small and very real. "Welcome back," he said, as if she had simply come in from a long walk. She looked at Cale, at the keep, at the fire, at Zoran on the floor, unhurried and present, as though there was nowhere in all of his territory he would rather be than this floor, right now, watching over these two people. "Am I changed?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Are you all right with that?" He held her gaze. "I am the one who asked you to trust me with it. I am the one who holds it alongside you. Whatever you are now, I am with you in it." A beat. "Are you all right with that?" She thought about it. Really thought, the way she thought about things that mattered. The new warmth in her chest that had not been there before. The particular way she could feel the territory around her. Not invasively, not like an intrusion, but the way you feel your own house around you when you come home. The outline of walls in the dark. The shape of the rooms you know. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where I am supposed to be." He reached across and took her hand. He held it. That was all. That was everything. The weeks that followed were full of the quiet work of aftermath. The Alpha Council opened a formal proceeding against Drexen Nightfang within the month. His network was dismantled the same way he had built it, piece by patient piece, each connection severed, each document surfaced, each factional alliance unwound until nothing was left of the redrawing but a cautionary record in the Highland Council archives. He would not be coming back. Varric Blackthorn arrived in early spring. He was thinner than Elwyn remembered, which she had expected. His hair had gone white at the temples, which she had not. He had spent the winter carrying something very heavy, with the particular stoicism of a man who willn't put a thing down until he knows the person he is carrying it for is safe. He held his daughter for a long time in the courtyard of Stormclaw Keep. Neither of them spoke. She breathed in the smell of him, old maps and ink and something warm she had known her whole life, and felt the particular settling that happens when the thing you have been holding without knowing you were holding it finally releases. When he pulled back, he held her face in both hands, a cartographer's eyes, reading what the terrain said beyond the surface features, the particular light in her, the particular solidity of how she stood, or the way she was not performing, being fine, but simply was fine, all the way through. He exhaled, his hands gentled on her face. "Good," he said. "Just that. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." He met Zoran the next morning, stayed a week, asked intelligent questions about the territorial history, and received complete, thoughtful answers. Spent 2 evenings in the archive with both of them, 3 of them around the same table, which felt to Elwyn like something she couldn't have described, but would have recognized immediately if she had known to look for it. The shape of a family, assembled. When he left, he embraced Zoran briefly at the gate, with the quiet warmth of a man who does not embrace easily, and means it absolutely when he does. He embraced Cale for a longer time. Cale, who had already decided that this was his grandfather, whether the paperwork agreed or not. The wedding was a Saturday in May. Actual Highland sunshine, the kind that appeared over the Stormclaw Mountains as if the weather itself had consulted the occasion. Elowyn noted this with satisfaction. Zoran noted it as a statistical anomaly. Both interpretations made her laugh, which was, she decided, the right energy with which to begin a wedding day. The stone chapel was warm. Every person in the Stormclaw pack was there. Arvella Ironwood, in the front row, breathing easily for the second season running, something in her face that had not been there before the winter. Cale Ironwood, standing at Zoran's side with his composure held together through considerable personal effort. Cale served as ring-bearer. He walked the length of the chapel aisle with the focused gravity of someone carrying something genuinely precious, which he was. He did not look at anyone. He looked at the rings in the small velvet box, and then at the place at the front of the chapel where he was meant to arrive, and he walked there with the full weight of his responsibility settled on him, and not a single wobble. He reached the front. He stood beside his father. He looked at Elowyn coming down the aisle, and something in his face opened completely. Not the careful, quiet hopefulness of the boy at the top of the stairs in January, but something wider. Something that had been given room to breathe. Zoran watched her come toward him. His face did the thing it had been learning to do since December. Opened, quietly, completely, without management or containment, or the 9-year winter of him, finally finished. He did not try to compose himself. He let it be seen by everyone in the room. Kyle, in his later account of the day, claimed that he maintained his composure through the vows. This was only partially true. He maintained the appearance of his composure through the vows. The appearance did not extend all the way to his eyes. Summer arrived in Stormclaw territory, the way warmth always arrives after very long cold. Not all at once. Room by room. A south-facing window first, where the afternoon light started reaching the sill again. Then the courtyard at midday. Then the training yard and the stables, and eventually the east corridors, which had been cold since October, and now held warmth until well after dark. At one day, Elowyn looked up from the map she was working on in the archive. Her own map now, a comprehensive survey of the territory's hidden water systems that would take 3 years and be the most accurate document of its kind in the north, and realized that the keep felt different. Not the temperature, the keep itself, its weight, the way it sat around her. It had stopped feeling like a place that remembered grief. It felt like a place that had decided to be something else. She could not name the exact day it happened. It had happened the way all important things happened in this place, quietly, and then all at once, and then simply as the truth of things. The Hawk arrived on a warm evening in late summer. The 3 of them were walking back from the eastern ridge, Zoran and Elowyn and Cale, hand in hand, and Cale telling them about the large, extremely opinionated crow who had taken up residence in the East Pine and had strong feelings about mornings and was making these feelings known daily and at volume. The Hawk came out of nowhere, black, silent. It landed on the wall beside the gate with a letter sealed in dark red wax hanging from its leg. The mark of the Highland Alpha Council. Zoran took the letter, read it once, his face holding its stillness with a slight effort she could see now, because she knew what to look for. He read it again, folded it, put it inside his coat. "Tell me," she said. He did. The council was aware of the Stormborn bloodline, now residing within Stormclaw territory. A formal review of its implications for Highland stability had been opened. she was required to present before the full council at the spring assembly. The evening was warm. The mountains above them were golden in the last light. The keep behind them held its lamps in its windows like eyes. She was quiet for one moment. Only one. "All right," she said. Cale's hand tightened in hers. She squeezed back. He looked up at her with the particular expression he got when he was deciding something large and had decided it. The expression that looked exactly like his father's, except younger and less careful about showing it. Zoran looked at both of them, at the warm windows, at the gates behind them, standing open as they had stood since January, since the night a stranger pushed through them in a storm and didn't leave. He took her hand. His grip was steady and sure and entirely without reservation. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "we face it together." Cale reached up and took his other hand, without being asked or invited. He held both of them and said nothing. He had already said everything he needed to, months ago, in a doorway, to a man who was only now fully understanding what the words had meant. "She is our light." The hawk lifted from the wall and disappeared into the summer dark. The keep burned warm behind them. The obsidian gates of Stormclaw territory, those ancient, wolf-carved, 9 years guarded gates, stood open in the last of the evening light, exactly as they had stood since the night a storm-soaked woman pushed them open and walked through into something she had not planned, had not mapped, and could not have navigated to by any route she knew. Elowyn looked at those gates for a moment. She thought about the girl she had been in December, wet through to the bone, her escape route gone, her horse refusing to move, standing in the dark in front of obsidian gates she had dreamed about and could not explain, with nothing in her hands but a candle someone had pressed there and a ruined map in her bag, and the stubborn, particular refusal to interpret any of this as an ending rather than a beginning. She thought about Varric Blackthorn's first lesson. Not the cartography. Earlier than that. The margin of the map is where the real country lives. He had said it when she was 5, which meant she had been applying it for 19 years without knowing that was what she was doing. Every time she had looked at the edge of a thing, a storm, a person, a room, she had been reading the margin. She had walked through these gates and into the margin of her own life and found that the margin was where she had always belonged. The real country was here. Cale's hand in hers, Zoran's hand around hers, the warm windows of the keep ahead, the crow making its nightly complaints from the east pine, the mountains gold and quiet above them in the last light. Whatever the council wanted in spring, she would meet it. She would walk into that assembly the same way she had walked into everything, with a straight back and honest eyes, and the complete, unhurried willingness to read whatever terrain she found without deciding in advance what it meant. She would not go alone. She had never, since January, been alone. She turned away from the hawk's disappearing line and looked at the keep instead. "Let's go in," she said. "Cale's crow will want its morning argument bright and early, and we should all be rested." "The crow," Zoran said, with great dignity, "needs to find a different pine." "The crow," Cale said, "has opinions. I respect that." They walked toward the warmth, all 3 of them. Some maps cannot be made in advance. Some territories can only be found by arriving. And some doors, once truly opened by the right person, at the right moment, in the right storm, simply stay that way. Forever.